Very much indeed. Welcome members to the 20th meeting in 2019 of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. And agenda item 1 is on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill, and we are going to be speaking to some witnesses on this, and we have with us today Willie Sullivan from the Electoral Reform Society, Dr Alistair Clark from Newcastle University, and Professor Toby James from the University of East Anglia. So just like to welcome all three of you. Thank you very much for coming along. We won't be having opening statements today. We're just going to move straight to the questions. And could we first of all have questions on term lengths? And Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. As you know, there's been quite a debate around the term length, and we've had different term lengths in this Parliament in its short life already. So can I ask what your view is on the proposal to move to fixed 5-year term lengths for both the Scottish Parliament and local government elections? And what do you think are the key advantages, if any, and disadvantages on the approach taken in this bill? Dr. Clark.
Thanks for the invitation to speak. Thanks very much for the question. I think there are benefits and drawbacks of 5-year terms. I mean, one is stability, and obviously in policy making, both at the parliamentary and local government level. And my own research has suggested that when elections clash, when they're held concurrently, that there can be problems in election delivery. The quality of those elections are problematic. So it's sensible to keep them separated as Scottish practice has been from 2007 onwards. I think a 4-year term remains possible, but what I would suggest, if that was deemed of interest, is maybe looking at doing that at a different point during the year. For instance, September has precedent given the independence referendum back in 2014. I have no objection to a 5-year term. I think the issue is for voters and not being able to hold people to account and judge their performance in an appropriate time.
Why do you say that? Because in other jurisdictions, you get presidential elections, sure. You get MPs elections and councillors all at the same time. I'm basing that on my evidence quite simply, which is due to doing research into the delivery of elections. And this is UK-wide or Britain-wide evidence on the conduct of local and parliamentary elections at the same time. When they were run together, those local authorities running 2 elections together actually showed that the delivery of those elections was a bit worse. And if you talk to electoral administrators about this, they'll explain the mechanics of this to you. It's the pressures of delivering 2 polls at the same time, staffing pressures, organisational, logistical pressures, and so on. Now, the reasons given for doing so are always to do with turnout and cost. Now, turnout often largely depends on other things, such as political parties getting out to mobilise electors in the first place. And even if you do run 2 sets of elections together, they still cost more than just running 1 set of elections to begin with. So the cost saving is not immediately obvious. Okay.
Yeah, I just wondered on that point if you had any evidence as to the undermining effect where on 2 levels. The first level being because there's 2 different systems being used in one single election, combining, and then the fact that is there anything that happens to, for instance, what might be perceived by the public as the lesser important issue, local government, or maybe it's the opposite way about, I don't know, but is there a differential in people's attitude and how the messaging attached to, say, local government compared to national or Scottish government, whatever it may well be, is there an impact there that you can
It's a good question. I would say two things to that. First of all, I mean, I think the obvious clash is potentially with a UK general election. Now, if that were held at the same time as, let's say, a Scottish local government election, you have voters being asked to do two very different things. Mark a cross on the UK ballot paper, but actually rank candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, on the Scottish Parliament voting paper. Now, there is scope for confusion there, and the last time that kind of thing was tried in Scotland was in 2007, when the local government elections were held at the same time as the parliamentary elections, and that ultimately led to the difficulties that were experienced with lots of ballots being rejected in the parliamentary election that year. In terms of does one campaign overshadow the other, typically the lower level of election. So typically the local government election is always overshadowed by the higher level one. So there are good practical reasons for people making informed decisions that elections are separated out.
Maureen, yeah. Oh, sorry, Wally, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to start by saying, and I think I made this point in the paper, that we often get confused, and we do lots of polling on this, between what is democracy and what is elections. And I think it's quite important to separate the two, or maybe a useful way to think about it is to separate the two and say, well, what is democracy? It's about sharing out power, it's about giving agency to people, it's about protecting them from the alienation that happens when they have no power over their own lives. And elections are just one mechanism of trying to do that. If you hold that thought, then they're important, obviously, to elected officials. I was a councillor. It was really important to me that I had the legitimacy of a decent turnout in an election, because that's where you get your legitimacy from. But and I did quite a bit of research on this and wrote a book called Missing Scotland, Missing Millions, Why Millions of Scots Don't Vote. Lots of people choose not to give their legitimacy to political institutions, and that includes local government at the time. I think it's not enough just to say that what we'll do is we'll put that election with another election so as we can increase turnout, give ourselves more legitimacy, and everything will be okay, because I think there's deeper questions to ask about why people don't feel it's important to turn out at local government elections in Scotland, because they do in lots of other European countries, and even why they don't turn out in huge numbers to vote at Scottish Parliament elections. So, to come back to the question, the difference between 4 and 5 year terms, I don't think it's that significant, really, to be honest. And therefore, if you're only putting elections together to increase the turnout at one or another, then I don't think that's good enough reason to have 4 year terms. And as I say, I don't think the difference, in our opinion, makes that much of an impact.
Just before Maureen comes in, sorry.
Just to be clear on this, are you saying that so far you can't see any difference in the turnout between if there are 4 year terms and 5 year terms? The turnout doesn't make a difference to turnout.
Yeah, I don't think it makes a difference to turnout. When you put them together, it makes a difference in turnout for the local government elections, obviously. And it's so. I think if you're avoiding them running, there's lots of reasons not to have them, as Doctor said, that to have them concurrently for administration purposes and resource purposes.
Right, just before, sorry Maureen, just so widen it out for you here actually, because I think Professor James wants to say something as well, actually. So.
Yeah, thank you for, again, the invitation and the great questions. I mean, to agree with much of what Alistair's saying there, it's worth pointing out that electoral officials have really been under something of a kind of perfect storm of pressures over recent years. Part of that is financial availability of resources. Part of that has been some of the significant changes in terms of the move to individual electoral registration. Some of that also is in terms of the increasing complexity of electoral law. So holding multiple events with multiple electoral systems does introduce risks to the system. The flip side is turnout. There is an advantage, for example, for a local election of holding it at the same time as a general election. It is more likely that people will vote while they're there. They're voting for a general election. They'll vote for a local election as well. But as you're rightly pointing out, it can be very confusing for voters in terms of campaign effects, because some local candidates are trying to campaign on something important in their issue, in their constituency, in their local ward, but it's drowned out perhaps by some of the media effects. I mean, just the one thing I think that is important is that part of the legislation seemed to be designed in terms of avoiding conflict with the general election, with view to that being in 2022. We know from what's happened in Parliament recently that the Fixed Term Parliament Act doesn't quite work in that way, and so trying to second guess exactly what's going to happen in Westminster, fixing a Scottish electoral law around that doesn't seem to be a very strong ground to be on.
And Alistair, just before, and then Maureen can come back in on that.
Just a very quick observation, and be careful of assuming that there's a major difficulty with turnout in Scottish local government elections. Turnout in Scottish local elections is among the highest in the UK. It was 47% for the 2017 local elections. By comparison, when English local elections are held on their own, typically turnout is round about a third of valid voters, 33, 34, 35%. So actually Scotland does well in this regard.
No, it compares to other places in Europe.
It's possibly lower, but there are different systems and so on. Well,
sure, I do think it's a mistake to just compare it with England, which is, we're up 60-70% in places in Europe for local government elections. So, let's aim high.
Increased turnout maybe later, but we're looking at it in terms of the voter, in terms of the government. Have any of you done any research about the efficacy of legislation in a 4-year term and a 5-year term? Because, from a government perspective, if you're going out to consultation on something that's in your manifesto, and then maybe you're getting very conflicting views, you might have to go back again. So actually getting legislation on a statute book is quite a difficult process. So have any of you looked at whether 4 years or 5 years helps whether you get better legislation or not, I suppose, because there could be a tendency to rush things and you get worse legislation if you had a 4-year term compared to a 5-year term, for example.
I've not done research on that myself, but I know there is a very strong argument for that being the case, and it's not just actually doing the legislation, getting that in the statute book, it's actually starting to deliver the policy as well and show some return on that. So, I mean, as I say, I'm not against 5-year terms at all. I think there's a strong enough case for them, and that is one of the reasons that can be given for them.
Okay, thank you.
Neil Finlay first, and then Tom Mason.
A point of clarity, if anybody can help me on this. We have fixed terms in here, but those does not necessarily need to apply if the Parliament takes that decision. I think the same as the UK government. Is that correct?
Yes.
Fine.
Thanks, Tom Mason, please.
Two issues here. One, I mean, we were talking about 5 and 4 years, or 4 and 5 years. Why not 6? I mean, what's the logic of the length of term? Where's the strategic argument there? And the other thing is on the turnout in other countries. Why do you believe they have higher turnouts? What's the drivers there?
I guess the term limit is about, I think it was Tony Benn said, you've got to be able to kick the people out. So I mean that's a basis of democracy, that you have to go to the people reasonably regularly and give them a say on whether the legislators or councillors have been doing a reasonable job. So I think there's a balance between.
Sure.
And I kind of agree. 5 years is probably a better term for you to be able to make legislation and do your business. Because stuff does get rushed and stuff falls off and stuff moves into the next Parliament. We've seen it with this Parliament for quite a few issues. Local government reform for one of them. why are some societies just have better democratic political cultures, and that is not an easy thing to do. And I think we've made the point in the paper that it's not just about how you make rules for your elections. It's about the institutions at local levels. It's about people involvement in their lives. It's about, you know, whether people are active and engaged citizens, look out for each other, work with each other. So it's about the political culture that's created both from the top down and the way that the values of that society. So it's not an easy thing to either describe or to create, but if you want, I mean, I personally think representative democracy is struggling quite a lot. And if there's interventions that need to be made culturally and radically with our institutions, then it might be worth doing it. If we're going to like develop, you know, it's not a matter of just saving our democracy as it is. It has to change into something that is much more relevant for this time.
Okay. Enu?
I mean, just to add, I mean, I guess you don't want elections too regularly, but obviously over time the mandate can begin to fade. 6 years is quite a long time. Circumstances change, and therefore I think, as Willie's saying, regular elections are also important. But I don't see too much difference between the 4 and the 5. Why don't people vote? There's lots of complex reasons. I guess it's what's in the control of the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government. One of the things is to do with the level of civic education, how we teach students, for example, within schools, and we can perhaps touch on that in other questions. But one of the things I think I set out in the evidence was to look at how we can encourage young people to register to vote while they are actively in their school, also within universities as well, but particularly in schools, and that can be embedded as part of a wider curriculum, which explains how the democratic system works.
Okay.
Just to add 2 very quick things, lowest turnout in Scottish local elections has typically been found in wards with fairly transient, sort of lower socioeconomic status wards. And I think there's work to be done in engaging people in those wards. I think the other thing I would say is, particularly in local government elections, it's not always obvious there are campaigns going on in local government elections. For instance, posters, where are the posters on lampposts and things of that sort? Now, there's been an ongoing controversy about that in Scotland and over the course of this decade. But if you compare that with Ireland, for instance, where there's a very obvious sense that there's a campaign going on. So it's incumbent on political parties also to get out there and mobilise people. And there's lots of evidence that suggests that does actually matter in raising turnout.
Back to Wally Sullivan, please.
Yeah, I did some research from a book, some qualitative research with focus groups in the East End of Glasgow and bits of Dundee of poorer people who didn't vote, and for many of them it was a conscious decision not to vote. They felt that over the years different parties had been in power, nothing had really changed in their lives. They knew people that were struggling. They cared about those people deeply, but they didn't think the political system had anything to offer them, and actually they knew that they were being asked to give their kind of approval and support and legitimacy to something that they thought that wasn't really doing anything for them. And one guy goes, like, "You think I'm zipped up the back? You think I'm going to give my approval to this that hasn't really done anything for me?"
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Can I just mention something actually in Glasgow City Council, they banned using posters on lampposts and all that. And one of my mates actually had nothing else to do in elections because that was his role, was getting up ladders and sticking things up. I personally think that lowered the whole tempo of elections because people weren't surrounded by the culture of an election at that time. But I do know that in other council areas they still do have posters and so on, but in some places I think we lost a wee bit of that sort of, that was good. Sorry, Neil, yes?
Yeah, well, be interested to see whether there's any correlation between the prominence of posters and turnout. I probably suspect there's not, but anyway. I think the point Willie makes is absolutely spot on, that it is not, should not come as any surprise to anybody that people in communities where they feel completely disenfranchised for the political system don't engage with the political system. That's just, you know, it looks as plain as the nose in your face. But and you know, in many ways, over the years, why would people engage when they do see that their community has been left behind? And I think the recent evidence of the Brexit referendum, indeed the Trump election campaign, shows that what people do when they have been left behind and then they perceive that there's an opportunity for change. So I think we're just stating the obvious there, but it's maybe a statement of the obvious that we don't get. Not a question.
No.
Do you agree?
You can, or you don't need to anyway. But Mark, please, thank you.
Well, it's just whether you think there's any correlation between the number of elected representatives and that kind of faith in democracy. I mean, you can go into some communities and, you know, there's nobody living there who is an elected representative. So are people actually meeting elected representatives? Because we've got a relatively low number compared to other European countries in terms of a proportion? Or is that lack of faith actually because people are meeting elected representatives, they just don't like what they're doing? Or is it that they see that they're genuinely not representative of their communities and they're not present in their communities? But
there is definitely correlation between numbers of representatives in European states and levels of turnout. You know, I'm not saying that necessarily is a cause, but I think my own experience as a local councillor and my own experience working as a policy person in local government over the years, and the size of the wards. I mean, you know, I think there was 23,000 people, and I mean, some of your councillors here. I'm sorry if I'm sharing my own experience, but it does. I think it does apply a little bit. How can one? Well, I'll take it up then. How can one person represent, you know, in a part-time job, 23,000 people, and how can they be part of that community? I know, you know, if there was somebody who was representing, say, Parknook in Dunfermline, a few hundred people, did a couple of hours a week, but was really part of that community and didn't have to turn into a semi-professional politician in order to do that job, then I think that level of representation and that connection between the local authority and their representation would be much better. Because representation actually means people like us, doesn't it, really, as much as being an advocate. And so I think if there's a system whereby it is actually people from the communities that are going up and speaking on behalf of them and then are not seen to be separate from them, because that's the impression that I get, that councillors and representatives are a separate group than the actual people that they're representing.
Okay, and Alistair, please.
Just say something slightly different to Willie, and that is that local government in Scotland and the UK as a whole is at a larger scale than you would find on continental Europe. So for a country the size of Scotland compared, say, Denmark or somewhere like that, so councils will typically represent far smaller communities. A city like Glasgow, which I think I'm right in saying is the second largest local authority in the UK, yeah, there'd probably be several councils within Glasgow, not just one single council. And so this, I think, is a difficulty. And what research shows in that regard is that the smaller these councils are, actually, the more engaged people feel with them, the more they feel they've got a degree of belonging. So I don't necessarily think it's about ward structures, although the things are related. I think it's actually about the scale we do local government on in this country to begin with.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. Maybe I wasn't particularly clear, but I mean, I think within those larger number of smaller local authorities, you know, you would want smaller ward sizes with you know, more representatives per head of population.
Pick at the ball, but we'll just let Tom Mason finish off, please.
I mean, I had a thing about the proposal to have increased numbers of councillors in wards, up to 5. I mean, I'm very interested because I am a local councillor at the moment. And what's your view on moving up to, well, they're suggesting either 2 for certain areas and 5, whatever. I mean, I personally have the view that the multi-member ward doesn't work very well.
Well, I think the issue comes back to, again, that we don't have enough local representatives. So if you're going to stick with the same number of local councillors, but your system also argues for better proportionality, then you're going to come up with bigger ward sizes with more members, because that gives you better proportionality. But that's kind of addressing it's coming at it the wrong way. I think you should be looking at having more local councillors and more local authorities, and therefore, you know, having 5 members for what would be quite a big ward wouldn't be such a problem, because you could have 5 members in quite a small ward where they could know virtually everybody in that ward.
I agree with that. I mean, I think one of the original aims of the Kelly Commission when they set out the single transferable vote was to achieve proportionality. And to achieve that, between 6 to 7 members per ward is probably the closest fit between votes and seats. What we have with 3 and 4 members in the Scottish system actually restricts proportionality quite a bit. So I think the 5-member proposal, I expect it to be used fairly sparingly, but is probably welcome because, you know, as Willie's pointed out, wards are bigger than they used to be, certainly. And, of course, there are differences in public opinion within those wards. So I think it's right that there be a number of representatives that voters can go to.
Will you just come on to that and then back to Tom, please?
I think we know in Scottish local government and in Scotland we have a multi-party democracy, and it works quite well because we've adopted electoral systems that allow that to kind of flourish. I think one of what we're seeing in the general election is that a multi-party democracy trying to break through, but constrained by a first-past-the-post system that means that all sort of party pacts, all sorts of tactical vote as electorates have become more educated and aware and able to get information, is really distorting the system. So I think in this general election you're going to see lots of constituencies where voters are not going to get a chance to vote for the party that they want to, despite that party existing. And so I think we have to say that Scotland has moved way beyond that, and it should continue to do so, because it takes proportionality. That is, the votes reflect the seats, and people connect that. Then we should, you know, continue to keep that as a strong principle of our electoral system and develop it as much as possible.
But within the multi-ward council system, you don't get accountability because you get 3 or 4 members accountable to maybe, if you say, could be up to 19,000 people.
Yeah.
And 4 or 5 people. You don't get that identification with the area. You don't get identification with a representative.
I think that's to do with the size of the ward rather than the number of councillors. I mean, when we had single-member wards, you know, even then the wards were too big. Some people knew who their local councillor was, some people didn't. So I think you know, you can address that if you want to hold on to proportionality for the reasons that I gave, because it is a good, you know, principle to have in a modern democracy. Then the way to address the levels of unaccountability in multi-member wards is to reduce the size of them by creating more of them.
You don't think a system of representation based on the Scottish national system of additional members would work better for proportionality and also have identification with a constituency?
I don't think it works. I mean, I think it works pretty well for the Scottish Parliament after it's bedded down. I think the single transferable vote definitely works best for the local government.
Yeah, but nobody understands it.
They understand that they cast their vote and that they get a representative by who on the basis of what preference they put on their ballot paper. They don't understand the count, but really, if you look at first past the post and the vagaries and balances of first past the post.
What I'm suggesting is a system where you get an identification with the area and somebody accountable for that area.
I don't think that. I mean, if you've got a 4, 5, 6 member ward and it's a small village, for example, and those people all come from that village, then I think that'd be fine. I think it is about the size of the wards because, and I think we've made quite a strong argument in our submission that instead of just the balance between the number of electors and the identifiable community should be reworked, because at the moment it's just, we think of the idea of using a representative per so many thousand of electorates, but actually why is that not equally balanced by you need representatives for an individual community? Just like in the EU you have, you know, qualified majority voting and each country has an equal weight. Why shouldn't a village or a community have more of an equal weight rather than just numbers of electorates? Is that clear?
Can I say two things? First of all, I think we're getting hung up on ward sizes here, and I think this is the wrong thing to get hung up on. We've mentioned 19,000 or something of that sort. That's very much the extreme. The average ward size is roughly about 12,000. Okay, so it's much smaller than 19,000. The question I think we should be thinking about is the fact that voters now have either 3 or 4 representatives able to represent them. Before, they only had 1. And that 1 may have been from a party that they didn't vote for, whereas now the proportionality tends to mean that they can actually go to a party representative that they may, you know, be more closely aligned to. So I think the ward size issue is frankly a red herring here. I think it's about representation. In terms of voter confusion, I'd just like to come back on that as well. And I've done some research into how voters have actually used the single transferable vote system. Now, what I found was that in 2007-2012, voters tended to use it in a very similar way to Irish voters who had much longer experience of using this system. In other words, the average number of preferences used was 3. Some people went all the way down to the bottom of the ballot paper, not many, granted, but you know, people were actually using the preference transfers. They were using them to actually, and 2 things, 1, transfer between party candidates where those parties actually had teams of candidates, but sometimes also to do differently, to actually choose candidates they may want. So it actually kind of weakens the hold of parties to some degree, which I think for voters is quite probably in this anti-politics, anti-party age, is possibly something that voters may want. So I think the idea that voters are confused by having to put 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm not so sure. You know, the statistics suggest that they use the system in a not dissimilar way to countries with much more experience of the system.
Thanks very much for that. Can I actually link that to something which might be relevant, hopefully, which is electronic voting? And the bill, the reform bill that we're talking about here, doesn't provide for electronic voting pilots, but it does contain enabling provisions for electronic voting to be introduced. Can I ask what range of practices that are used internationally could fall under the banner of electronic voting, and are there any examples where it's been trialled or used that you can come up with? Toby.
So, I mean, it is a very broad term as set out in the bill. I think there are actually some advantages of that, because the idea here is that we're looking forward and thinking about what possible systems could be envisaged or invented in the future. As it currently exists, one mechanism is internet voting, remote internet voting. So the most obvious example of that is in Estonia, where it's possible for citizens using their national identity card. It's important that they have a national identity card to make that system work. They can vote remotely, and they can do so even on the day of the election. And we have piloted that before in the UK in the early 2000s, but I think, as my evidence suggests, it was done simultaneously with lots of other kind of mechanisms. So internet voting is one option. Another is basically just allowing people to vote using electronic machines in polling stations. So they still have to physically turn up, but perhaps they're pressing a button on a screen which would allow them to cast their vote. And there's lots of variations within that. I think international best practice is pointing towards the use of kind of voter-verified, auditable paper ballot papers coming out the other end there. So they press the button and then a ballot paper comes out in which it's clearly marked and goes into a box. The voter can see that, so that they're not left with the uncertainty about whether their count was correctly recorded. And that is tending to be seen as the main option. So as it stands, those are the two kind of variations, but it is very broad as it is set out in the bill, and that does allow some flexibility for evaluating different systems going forward.
Thank you very much, Toby. Wally, did the Electoral Reform Society had any view on this? Or?
Our view is that we'd be interested in pilots. I mean, that's Technoway Technologies developing the system that Toby described there about a paper receipt coming out is something that we think is quite important, so as the voter can see it and so as it's checkable. Yeah. Right. And Neil, yeah.
I was an observer at the presidential election in Venezuela in 2012, and please don't believe all you read in the newspapers about the voting system in that country, because the Jimmy Carter Foundation for Democracy said it's the most sophisticated voting system in the world, and it's an electronic-based system, which is, I think, 12 internal audits within the system. But what was interesting, when you went into the polling station, there was a system, you actually gave your thumbprint to say that you had voted, actually in ink. You had an indelible ink put on your pinky to say that you had voted, so you couldn't vote again. They had terminals where you voted electronically. You got a ballot paper and you put it in the box, and then you signed to say you had voted. The interesting part of that was, I think it was at 52%, I think it was, of polling stations after the election, as soon as the election is closed, all of the party observers stand around the table and the boxes are opened in front of people, and every vote is shown to the party people, and then it's ticked off, and that is tallied with a press of the button on the electronic voting system, and if the two numbers match, it goes to the central polling station. When I compared that to, 2 sheets of plywood, a string and a pencil, it just put our system into perspective. So I think there is a lot we can learn from other countries, particularly where they have developed their own electronic systems that have been verified and accredited internationally. Have you looked at any of these types of systems?
Not particularly in terms of Venezuela, but
or others.
But I mean, I think I pushed the broad point that, I mean, we're talking about low voter turnout earlier on and groups that are less likely to vote. Above all else, it is young people, so the availability of new technology to try to address that problem and to explore that problem, I think would be very, very welcome. There are obviously security threats with internet voting, and I think for very high level, for general elections, for independence referendums, I think that it shouldn't be something to be considered. But at a local level, where turnout is still low, then that's something very much worth looking at. And I agree, it is the case that many of the procedures developed in the UK have kind of Victorian origins. Democracy has spread since then, and it means that international best practice has moved on. We don't have the opportunity to audit elections in Scotland, for example. You can audit elections in other jurisdictions, even kind of paper systems. So there is scope to look at that.
What about all postal ballots?
Well, I say we had some pilots in the UK in the early 2000s, UK-wide. The idea there was to increase voter turnout. Out of all these new mechanisms, and they included things like internet voting and mobile phone voting, the one that had the major increase in turnout was actually postal votes. And automatically sending out postal votes to constituents meant there was an enormous boost in turnout. I mean, there have been concerns raised about fraud since then. That said, some security provisions have subsequently been put in place. But in terms of a single measure that could lead to a major increase in turnout, it is all postal voting elections.
So would you recommend that?
It's something worth considering in more detail.
I'll come to the question of electronic voting rather than all postal, if I may. I mean, I think what's being proposed in this bill is unacceptably wide. It seems to me to be a bit of a blank cheque because, as Toby's mentioned, there are all sorts of things that can fall under the remit of electronic voting. It might be internet, it might be voting machines, and so on and so forth. And I think the committee would be wise to try and talk to the Scottish Government about what they actually have intended. I think pilots are fine, but there can be a whole range of cost, commercial, and so on implications for all of this, and particularly security implications, even for voting machines in polling stations. Now, one thing that's not been mentioned, I mean, there have been countries that have adopted e-voting, electronic voting, and have gone back from it. Ireland, for instance, trialled this in, I think it was 2002, and I think 3 or 4 constituencies with voting machines, and basically mothballed their machines immediately afterwards and have never resurrected them again. The German Constitutional Court effectively has banned electronic voting on the grounds that without specialist knowledge, in other words, without specialist computer science, computer programming knowledge, it's very difficult for the ordinary person to understand how votes have been converted into seats. And that's a fairly important ruling, I think, that sometimes gets forgotten in this. So while there are potential applications, I think there are certainly things to give pause, particularly in security and cost issues as well.
Thank you very much for that. Toby, just
very briefly, just about one of the ways of increasing transparency is to use software that has open source availability, so other programmers can check exactly how, for example, vote machines tally that. There was a discussion in New South Wales, Australia, for example, about that very issue.
Okay, thank you. That's good. Good note that, please. Thank you. Can we move on, please, to the list order effect? I have mentioned the hopefully mythical constituent called Aaron Aardvark, but I think it's quite important that we do talk this through, and I think Gil's got some questions on it, please.
Yeah, it's a straightforward question. If you think, first of all, if there's an advantage in the list system, depending on what the alphabet is on your name.
There are alphabetical advantages on all ballot papers, whether those are first past the post, single transferable vote, or whatever, and that's been shown by research. The difficulty that's been raised in Scotland is less by all parties. It's by parties in particular who offer more than one candidate. Okay, so that means it's specifically the SNP and the Labour Party that have arguably been affected by this. So there are effects. What you then go and do about it then, I think, is less obvious. There may be, I mean, Robson rotation was talked about at one point, which was remarkably complex. I think we've rode back from that to far less complex ideas, drawing straws and wards and so on and so forth, which may well be possible. But just to reiterate, one of the big difficulties in the 2007 problem that saw lots of ballot papers rejected was a change to Scottish Parliament ballot papers. And I think any ballot paper reordering or something of that sort really needs rigorous testing to make sure that something of that sort doesn't happen again. I know the Electoral Commission have been doing some work around this, but I think my advice would be to proceed with caution. There's certainly an effect, but proceed with caution, because I think the last thing we want to do is then increase any voter confusion out there when it's something that really only affects maybe a couple of parties.
Anybody else?
Just to agree, the research does show that it does have an effect, and I think I agree with that, Alice's points there about the Scottish context. The Australian workaround is they have a draw. It's a bit like the FA Cup draw, where you can see exactly who is going to be located into each position. So that is an option. I guess I would add that there's an effect on the electoral administrators here as well. So any such draw would have to be done quite early so that they could get ballot papers printed, assuming we're using a paper system. And of course, the electoral timetable there then becomes very narrow in terms of having that draw, getting the ballot papers printed, and so on. So that has to be mindful of that. But it does have an effect. It is an unfair advantage for, I forget the candidate you were referring to, but...
Anyway,
I think I should have declared an interest, having been a person that's always been at the back of the queue, called Patterson. I always thought it should be your first name, but anyway, it's another story. But
just
obviously,
before you go on from that, Gil, just to let Neil in on that basis.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, Mark was very kind enough to remind me that when we had the election a few years ago, when we had a party that put its branding as Alex Salmond for First Minister, indeed to get priority on the ballot paper. So I think we very much need to address this issue. I think it's a serious issue that affects our democracy, and we would be neglecting, I think, our duty in this committee if we did not, at least within our report, raise this as a very serious issue that people and the witnesses have raised, and that we'll look at how we are going to address this rather than just skim over it.
Okay. Yep. Well, I'll go to Willie first, and then Alistair. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there is an effect. I wouldn't overplay the effect to say it's as much as a threat to democracy. There's a small effect in local government, and as has been said, I would just amplify everything that the other two witnesses had said, that we have to be really careful that the cure is not worse than the problem, because there is issues such as accessibility, auditing the election, if there's, afterwards, how difficult it's going to be if there's randomisation of papers to recheck them, because so I think the pilotings is a good approach. And obviously, when in Ireland, where the parties seem to be much better at vote management, then it doesn't seem to be much an issue. So, if parties could get their vote management better in some of the areas, then the alphabetisation, the list order effect would probably be reduced quite substantially.
Thanks, Willie. And Alistair?
I agree with what Willie's just said, but just to come back on Neil Findlay's point, which I think is an interesting one, the question then arises, does the Scottish Government then look at randomisation for Scottish Parliament ballot papers, both for the list and the first past the post part of the system? I think that's a broader question.
Thank you. And Gil?
There is another aspect to this with regards to someone who maybe expect the list to be in an alphabetical order. So if they expect that, and I looked at the amount of money that cornflakes adverts had since the war. It's a phenomenal amount. It's the same box, it's the same message, and they keep saying the same thing. So that, how would you get over to the public if you changed the system that, you need to look further down the list because the person you were looking for isn't at the top of the list because they normally expect it to be maybe a answering my own question, but I just wondered how you feel about that aspect of it. Somebody maybe that's got a disability or expectations for older people who have no disability, but their order of life has always been alphabetical.
Well, I had a meeting with the elections unit at the government to talk about it, because obviously list ordering is a big concern for the society, and it's a bit of the single transferable vote that could cause a problem. But again, I think their big concern was accessibility. Some of the disability organisations had expressed concern about that. So again, I think we've got to be careful that the problem is not, is not cured by something that affects the voters in a even more negative way.
The only thing I would add to that is that obviously if you do randomise local government ballot papers. You then get the Scottish Government to look at Scottish Parliament ballot papers. The Scottish Government has no control over UK general election ballot papers, which would still continue to be alphabetically ordered. So there is still potential for confusion. Maybe not in local government elections, but at another level of election as well in doing this.
I think the Electoral Commission did a study here on this, particularly for the Scottish Government, and I don't think they found that voters did find it difficult to locate the voters, but the committee should probably just look at that study.
Okay, Maureen? Thanks.
Yeah, I think my question follows on from that, because are we not placing too much emphasis on randomisation, because people actually don't normally vote for candidates, they vote for the party. The candidate actually has very little influence on the outcome. It's actually parties that people seek out rather than the names of the candidates. I mean, you know, in any election, well, I studied politics way back in the 70s, well, 60s and 70s. You know, I think there was a book called Blondel that said that the candidate was only probably worth 1,000 votes. I think John Curtis would probably say maximum is maybe 3,000 votes. So, you know, little has changed in all that time.
I think that's a really good point, because the question is the voter getting what they want? And do they just want a representative from that party, or do they want a particular representative from that party?
There is a clear effect. So, I mean, to be clear, there is a clear effect, but I think it's worth remembering, I think that's an important point, there are other sources of advantage and disadvantage as well. One of those may be party, another one may be incumbency. People may actually vote for the local councillor because they know his name, they've got, or her name, they've got good name recognition, and they've been of service to the community. You know, we just don't know how some of these things would disentangle themselves. So there are different things playing into this, I think, as well.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, everyone. Can we move on, please, to prohibition on voting more than once and electoral registration in more than one area? And Mark, you've got some questions on this, please.
Well, that's pretty much the question, really, about whether you agree with the prohibition of voting in more than one area on one day. But I think, you know, related to that is perhaps the whole principle about being on multiple electoral registers. And I was just thinking in my own mind on the way here this morning, I did a couple of by-elections in Fife, for example, today, and if you were, say, a young person, you'd grown up in Dunfermline, you moved to Edinburgh, you might want to vote in the council elections here on council election day. But then if you were still registered back home in Fife, would you also want to vote in a by-election maybe, but on a different day? So the whole principle of being on two registers is one thing. The principle of prohibition of voting, you know, voting early and voting often on day of election is something else. But your thoughts on both of those would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to argue against changing the law so that people can't vote twice. I think that's probably a given that should be amended. The question then is, can you actually easily identify anyone who has done so? And because we have multiple electoral registers, that is very difficult. I think many people have advocated, for example, the move to single electoral registers, and as a way of kind of possibly preventing that. I mean, I would add that I don't think there is that much evidence that it is very widespread. I mean, you know, we're sort of kind of university lecturers where we know that our students, for example, have very mixed sense of identities. They do perhaps have, some of them have identity with where the university is. Others will have identity kind of back kind of home. I think it's understandable and right that they are able to choose between them.
Okay, thank you. Wally, would you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, but also I think Wales is trialling a single register, so it might be worth looking there to see how they get on with that, because that would address some of those issues.
Does that allow you to be registered in different electoral districts, different wards, or you just have one place of residence?
I think
that's it.
Yeah, yeah.
Or can you switch, kind of?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm guessing that you'd probably be registered in one place. Yeah, it doesn't really address that, does it, really?
The broader problem is that with the electoral registers in general, there are huge issues with duplicate registrations. There are huge issues with inaccuracies, an even greater issue with people missing from the electoral register entirely. And so having a single electoral register as opposed to a kind of patchwork of multiple allows administrators to check for those issues. I mean, there was it probably would have to be UK-wide, but there's one proposal has been to enable people to check whether they're registered online, a kind of am I registered website. I don't know how that would be possible within Scotland, but that kind of ownership of your individual record is really important, because there are major issues there.
Yeah.
There is one infrastructural issue feeds into some of this, because in Scotland there are 4 different electoral management softwares used to maintain the electoral register. And so getting them to be able to talk to one another so these sorts of things could actually happen, I think would probably be an important step on the way.
Okay. Do you have any other comments on the bill? I mean, the bill is obviously, here, we have it in front of us, but is there anything that's missing? I was particularly struck by, electoral reform. You were talking about the way that we deal with by-elections and proportionality issues, but so that's I think one point. But if there's anything else that you think in terms of the scope of the bill, it would be useful to hear that.
I think the by-elections is a key point. I think we've seen, when you go to an AV referendum after, it can upset proportionality in the ward, in the council, and in fact I think in Dundee at one point it actually shifted the administration. So, and everybody kind of, if they've been involved in a by-election, can see the kind of unfairness of it, that the representation of that party is just completely wiped out because of the weight of another party's votes in the whole of the ward instead of just the proportionality system.
Yeah, 2 things I think are missing, and they're kind of in my written evidence, but one is the kind of complaints process for citizens. There's the judicial process that a citizen could go through to overturn an election, but in most cases that's not what they're after. They've got an issue, they just want to perhaps flag this so that perhaps next time things run better, and that would provide a useful information for electoral services to run the election better. So that could be the Electoral Management Board for Scotland running that, or it could be the Electoral Commission having a single point on their website where someone can flag an issue. We saw problems earlier in the year with European elections, for example, EU citizens not being able to vote. And there's huge confusion about, was this just a few people making a lot of noise on social media, or was this a wider spread issue? And that would help identify that. So something the committee could recommend. And the other issue is under registration. So I think we've already kind of touched on that in part, but the Electoral Commission research identified that within Scotland is potentially 630,000 up to 890,000 Scottish citizens who are eligible to vote and missing from the electoral register. We're looking to change, obviously, the franchise. The bill here looks to register attainers within enable the registration of attainers. Attainers are one of the main groups which are under-registered. Because of the move to individual electoral registration, it used to be the case that their parents could add them to the electoral register. So the bill doesn't really have any kind of solutions to that problem. I mentioned some in the written evidence, but really here, this is something that could be done within schools. It could be requirements for schools to introduce kind of citizenship classes, explaining how to register to vote, and that could be done either periodically or in advance of an election. A direct way is to try to automatically register those citizens. There are potentially legal privacy issues to kind of look at there, but there isn't anything in the bill to fix that problem, and that's something the committee could recommend.
Most of my recommendations are in my written evidence, but there's two things I'd want to stress, and they're both to do with the Electoral Commission and the enforcement of electoral law, which I think has become increasingly important in recent years. The first is that Scottish Parliament elections and the reporting of donations is out of sync with what's expected in, for instance, a UK general election, which is weekly reporting of donations. It's only quarterly for Scottish Parliament elections, and I think there's a strong transparency case for arguing for that to be brought into line, certainly a more regular reporting publicly of donations. The second thing relates to something the Cabinet Secretary said last week in the debate on the Referendum Scotland Bill, which was that he's minded, in fact he is going to introduce amendments to that bill with relation to the Electoral Commission's ability to increase the fines from £10,000 to £500,000, and I think there's an argument for trying to get a degree of consistency here in Scottish electoral law, both in referendums and in electoral law generally.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Mark. Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses, our guests, very much indeed, actually. I think that's been extremely helpful. There's quite a lot of notes have been taken, which we can follow up on, and the committee thanks you very much for your attendance. Thank you. And can we just suspend for a few moments, please, to allow a changeover of witnesses? Thank you very much for that. It's great. Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks very much for what we've had so far, and I'm sure the next section will be equally as enlightening and helpful. And I'd like to welcome to the meeting Vonnie Sandlin, Public Affairs Manager, Equality and Human Rights Commission, and also Ravati Campbell, Convener of the Scottish Youth Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee. And thank you both for coming in today. As with the previous session, we won't be entering into having a statement or to open. We'll just go straight to questions, if that's all right with you. And could just open up by asking, because you might have heard previously, as part of its response to the Scottish Government's consultation on electoral reform, the Scottish Youth Parliament, as you all know, asked young people whether they thought that the Scottish Government should introduce electronic voting. Do you think from that that there is support for electronic voting in Scotland? Ravati, I think if you would like to go first, please.
So yeah, we in our response to the Scottish Government's consultation, we found that 51% of our respondents actually supported the idea of having some form of electronic voting. But interestingly, in another consultation that we conducted, our young people still found that they preferred to vote in person, actually, at a polling station. But that should still be an option, though, the electronic voting. The main rationale behind that, to have electronic voting, was that it would ease the process, the voting process, but also that it would make it more accessible for those with disabilities. So whether that's those who will have eyesight problems, those who are perhaps quadriplegic, who have cerebral palsy, that electronic voting would actually ease the process for them as well.
Do you think, this is just guesswork, do you think because the use of electronic machines is much more common now than it ever was previously, and that younger people have more access and more use, are more used to using computers and electronic machinery and for access to all sorts of things? Do you think that that might prove to be something that would become natural, actually, rather than something which they would have to think a lot about or be trained in or whatever?
I think the electronic side of things is more important leading up to an election, so young people can learn more about the political process through that. But in terms of the actual voting itself, I think we found that our young people prefer the voting in person because it makes the voting feel more important to them. The main rationale behind not supporting electronic voting was actually based on a large lack of trust and confidence in the voting process. We had mass concerns about hacking, what would happen with those votes. And also, actually, that was the interesting thing. We had one side saying, like I said just before, that it would make it more accessible, but then on the other hand, it wouldn't make it more accessible for those who perhaps are autistic. That electronic voting would be overly stimulating, would actually prevent them from voting.
Thank you. Yeah. Mark, do you?
Yeah, just moving on to barriers to people voting. I mean, Vonnie, I think in your submission, you indicated particular barriers to people with incapacity, trans people, in terms of voting. Could you talk through what those barriers are and how we might be able to overcome them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, particularly when you, in our submission, when we talked about individuals with incapacity, the issues around about the pledge that one has to take when registering to vote. So an individual who may be eligible to vote, but who has another person who has power of attorney. The Electoral Commission guidance states that the person with power of attorney does not have the right to register the individual to vote. In our opinion, we believe that guidance has perhaps been incorrectly interpreted from the legislation, and we would hope to see that clarified in a way that seeks to enfranchise people who have deemed to be with incapacity. On the subject of electronic voting, the HRC doesn't have a particular position around about whether implementing electronic voting is a good or not thing, but what we would seek within any process that's taken forward is that any new systems are co-designed and co-produced with disabled people to make sure that they are fully accessible. Any system that further enfranchises disabled people is something that would be welcomed by the Commission, but that has to take into consideration that there is no one state of disability, that it is a spectrum, that different disabled people experience challenges and barriers in different ways, and that has to be given the most full consideration possible.
And sorry, what about the barriers in relation to trans people? Or?
Yes, sorry, you had asked me about that as well. So in the written evidence, you'll see that in the run-up to the 2017 general election, trans people were reporting difficulties in registering to vote online, and that's because for those trans people who have registered a gender identity certificate or registered themselves in their new identity, and using their national insurance number as verification, that their national insurance record is then locked for privacy reasons, which is an admirable rationale. But the unintended consequence of that then is that those individuals then have to go and register in person to go and get their vote in their new name. And for obvious reasons, trans people may not be comfortable talking about their previous name and their previous identity and how that relates to themselves and how they see their personality and their identity now. These are things that I think in creating a new system to respond very effectively, I think, to change, it's just been one of those things that I think that has been well intended, but the unintended consequence of that has been added an extra barrier to trans people that I think can be quite easily alleviated.
Is there a barrier there with people who are intersex as well?
The barrier particularly that we had identified were people who had changed their sex, their gender identity certificate, or through self-definition. So I wouldn't want to make a specific reference to intersex people. The issue is about people who have changed their sex using the gender identity certificate or self-declaration.
Okay, thanks.
Can Gil just come in and back of that, please?
Power of attorney, and I was interested in what you said, and I wondered how you feel about, how that would work with someone who has no capacity. So therefore, who would actually be voting? Would it be the person voting for their own preference who would effectively then, the power of attorney would have 2 votes, because the person without capacity clearly wouldn't know how to vote?
I think that's getting into real specifics in individual cases that would need to be given really serious and thoughtful consideration, because I think when it comes to adults with incapacity, you'll know yourself from talking to different adults who have been deemed to have incapacity that there again is a spectrum of where they are and that line. Some people may well still be able to make a decision that reflects their own beliefs. For other people, the person with power of attorney may well serve as a proxy voter, and you would expect within that situation that the person with power of attorney knows the wishes and perspectives of that individual sufficiently well enough to be able to make that vote.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, can we just ask Mark, beg your pardon, Neil, if you've got some questions, please?
Just in terms of information going out to voters and what kind of format and how that would best be done. I mean, when I worked as a teacher in school, I found young people very informed about elections and voting when, obviously I was a modern studies teacher, so that was what their interest was in. But is there any ways in which we can expand information going out, and what kind of formats do you think that would best be for young people, and not for it or for everyone indeed, to understand electoral systems, the voting process, etc.?
So we actually have, the Scottish Youth Parliament has policy on saying that we think that all secondary schools should have some form of compulsory political classes, not necessarily modern studies, but some form of class that would educate young people on the political systems, how voting works, in order for them to make an informed decision. Like, this would be the best way that they could have their first look into engaging with politics. I think probably one of the best ways is running different sessions with youth workers specifically, who know the best way to engage with young people. Also, I have but then also, so we run a survey called Watch Your Take, which is a mass consultation survey distributed all across Scotland, and we found in that 58% of young people feel or felt ready to vote at 16. But the reason for those who didn't was purely because of lack of knowledge and competence around the political system. And that's why we think it's really, really important that, like I said in that motion, that young people are educated on the process. And like you said, young people are informed. They have opinions about issues. But then when that is applied to the political system, that's more the grey area, when they're not 100% sure how to approach that.
Just on the back of Neil's question, Mark, you got something?
Yeah, we're also looking at a franchise bill at the moment, and I'm just interested, Rawati, whether you think that the candidacy rights should be extended to 16-year-olds as well as voting rights, and how that might feed in then to education if you've got people in high schools who could actually be standing for election as well as having a vote.
So the Scottish Youth Parliament as well has policy on that we do believe that the candidacy should be lowered to 16. I mean, if you can vote at 16, you should be able to stand as well for that. I think a lot of young people's, why they perhaps feel disengaged with politics is because they don't feel that their opinions are valued or that they don't have a say in the process. And by lowering that candidacy age is a big sign of saying, we want your input into that.
Is that a view across Scottish Parliament and local government elections, or just local government elections? I mean, is there any sort of arguments around how that could be restricted, should be restricted, or?
I couldn't say based off the policy itself what elections that refers to on an individual level. I would say I think local elections are the best way that, through consultations that MSYP, so members of the Scottish Youth Parliament, do within our local authorities, we often find that constituents have lots of thoughts about their own local communities, and I think that's for local communities would be the best elections for young people to be getting involved in.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, that's great and useful. Allowing voter registration from the age of 14, Gil, if you...
A fairly straightforward question. That the bill's proposing that 14-year-old people will be allowed to register. Just wonder what your thoughts are on that. Is it a benefit, or do you think that's too early for registration itself?
Definitely think it would be a benefit. By having it at 14, that means that young people can get involved from, they've got that 2 years between 14 to 16 to educate themselves, learn about the process, learn about political parties, what they represent, whether that fits into their ideologies. But whether that would actually encourage young people leads me back to what I've been saying before, is that if young people don't know about the system, whether that would actually encourage them to register for it, I'm not 100% sure, but having it there as an option is important.
I was just going to add to that obviously, the Commission doesn't have a position on early enfranchisement, but what we, as the regulator of the Equality Act and age as a protected characteristic, can see the value in having that earlier registration for younger people, particularly if they're still in full-time education, and the opportunities then exist within the school to be able to empower young people to understand the power of their vote and how to participate in the democratic process. So anything that expands the participation of young people in the democratic processes would be something that we would seek to support.
You've kind of second-guessed my next question, and so I wondered if you thought that perhaps presently the engagement on elections start nearer the age of 16, would this lower the threshold possibly, so that the engagement process starts at 14, so it's given 2 years to really think about what it means to vote itself?
Sorry, could you explain that a bit more?
Well, by lowering the age to 14, the engagement starts with the political process rather than at 16, or does that not count in any way?
I think young people are engaged from, even younger than 14. I mean, the Scottish Youth Parliament, our age ranges from 12 to 25. And then also you have the Children's Parliament outside of SYP. So young people they care about the countries and the communities they live in from a very, very young age. That doesn't just start at 14. I think that answers your question.
Okay.
I think, again, the Commission doesn't have a particular position on this, but I think that over the last sort of few years, it's been quite clear from the approach that schools have been taking talking about being rights respecting schools, about embedding pupil democracy in schools and sort of encouraging young people to participate in the life of their own school, that the political process and being involved in the political process is being introduced to young people outside of a modern studies classroom. So I think any opportunity that then supports schools to be able to build on the activity that they're doing to encourage young people's participation will be positive.
Thanks for that.
Thanks very much for that, and thanks, Gil. 10 lengths, Maureen, would you?
Okay, I know the term length of an MSYP is 2 years, and that's probably to get the turnover and get more people involved. But different legislatures have different lengths of terms, mostly 4 or 5. Do either of you have a view on what the term length should be?
the Equality and Human Rights Commission doesn't have a particular perspective on what the term length should be, but as with anything else that we would comment on, it's about how those changes are communicated and how the electorate are involved in that process and those discussions to make sure that they're fully informed of what those changes mean for individual people and how they're able to access their democratic rights.
I suspect your answer is because you're coming at it from the voter's point of view.
Yeah.
But as an organisation that is consulted by governments, I don't know about local government, but certainly by government, in terms of policy making, do you have a view in that regard? Because, you know, it sometimes takes a long time to work up a bill, and even the consultation can throw up things that perhaps civil servants or the parties in their manifesto hadn't thought about, and often you have to go back for consultation again. So from that point of view, Vonnie, do you think there's an argument for a 4 or a 5?
I suppose I'm mindful. I would like to go back and have conversations with colleagues, particularly as we're a GB-wide organisation. I think that our thinking around this hasn't really been focused from that perspective. I think having observed what's happened with the early general election being called at Westminster and what that's meant for some bills that have been in traction that have now fallen, I can understand the appeal of having fixed terms. But I think, again, reflecting on we're about to go into the 3rd general election, in what would have been a fixed term, I think that the notion of changing to 4 or 5 year terms may still be changed by the parties in power or the opposition parties in order to enact political change. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very clearly. I think the response that I would have really would be that the fixed term almost doesn't matter if it can still be changed within the process of that term anyway.
Does that not say more about whether the governments respect the legislation that they actually put forward and pass? Anyway, what about Vati? What do you think?
The Scottish Youth Parliament doesn't have any strict policy regarding terms length. On a personal level, I think it would be really interesting to investigate that area, especially like you said, SYP's term lengths are only 2 years. It'd be really interesting to investigate with young people what they think the pros and cons are with either term length. I think probably one of the main benefits of SYP's term lengths, why we have 2 years, is that, like I said, our age range is from 12 to 25. And we have MSYPs who could be coming in at the age of 14 and leaving at 16. And I mean, you've all been at those ages they're very, very different life points, very different life experiences, different decisions. You have a different perspective of yourself, what you think your communities look like. And that's why it's really important that we have that constant turnover of young people to make sure that all the young people are represented, because you come into SYP as one person, you leave as a different person. And you can bring different skill sets and different knowledge sets to the young people in your communities by having that constant turnover.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's interesting, actually. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Just on the back of that, I think you've made a very strong point. Do you think there should be restrictions on the amount of times that MSPs should be able to stand for Parliament? So, for example, if MSYPs do a 2 year term and then they may move on, do you think maybe MSPs should only be able to do 2 sessions or 3 sessions and then, like we do in the United States?
I couldn't talk from the Youth Parliament's view on that. Currently, actually, I think it's being implemented in the next coming term for MSYPs. We have I think it's a strict 2-term limit now, and that again is to ensure that we're getting diverse and different people coming in. Regarding MSPs, on an individual level, yes, I would say so, for the exact same reasons that you need to constantly have new ideas coming through Parliament.
Thank you. And that actually brings us on to anything which you think needs to be included in the bill as it comes forward, which may be there, may not be there. Is there anything that's really strikes home that you think hasn't been addressed? Vonnie, first, please.
So the Commission's recommended within our response that the Scottish Government builds on current initiatives and uses the general positive action provisions under Section 158 of the Equality Act 2010 to take action to tackle barriers to elected office and to build confidence, particularly amongst women and all of those from all underrepresented groups interested in standing for elected office. we would encourage a position of co-design and co-production of any system change to maximise participation in our democratic processes. So that co-design and co-production has to involve the people that it's going to affect, so particularly disabled people, as I mentioned earlier on, and from a spectrum of different impairments as well, to make sure that those are covered with any future considerations. And the only other thing, particularly considering digital inclusion and intergenerational digital approaches, any transition has to be a gradual one, and one which supports generations that are perhaps not digitally included at the moment, to make sure they continue to be included in the democratic processes moving forward.
That makes sense, yep. And Ravati, anything that you can think of at all?
Actually, one of the mass views that was expressed by young people we consulted with was about that all legal residents in Scotland and in the UK should be able to vote. I'm an Australian citizen. I can vote as a result of coming from a Commonwealth country. However, we have, obviously there's many immigrants coming to Scotland and the UK who are not from Commonwealth countries and as a result can't vote. We've actually had MSYPs who are refugees or asylum seekers who can't vote. And it's a bit, it's the irony that you're a part of a Scottish Youth Parliament, quite an influential body, and yet at the same time you can't even vote in elections that affect the young people that you're meant to be representing.
Okay, that's interesting. Actually, because in the franchise bill that we were just working on, that was addressed actually as well. So that's actually very interesting to hear your viewpoint and where it's coming from there. Actually, so that's good. Okay, I don't know. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Sorry. Would it be possible to add on to one of your earlier questions? I just had a thought. Just regarding your question about 14-year-olds being able to register. Recently, the Scottish Government ran a pop-up consultation at our recent October sitting in Dunfermline, and the majority of MSYPs agreed that young people should be able to register at 14 and that it would encourage young people to vote. But again, like I said, the majority also agreed that without that education element to it, young people, it may not make that much of a difference.
Yeah, I think that's important actually, is the educational side and understanding the importance of elections and why people should take part in them as well, actually.
Well, even, and probably this falls into Vonnie's remit slightly, is that not even just an education around the political system, but education around biases, diversity, issues that just don't affect the individual. Mm-hmm. The issues that affect Vonnie are different that will affect me, and it's important that when you're making a decision about what political party, what candidate to vote for, that you actually think about how is this going to affect other people, right, not just me as an individual.
Okay, thanks. I think that's really worthwhile. Thank you. Anyone else got any points? Okay. Well, I'd really like to thank you very much indeed. That was very useful to us because a number of notes have been taken of issues that you brought up, and it reinforces some things which we were already heading for, but brought in 2 or 3 new angles as well. So that was great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of today's public part of the meeting, and I'd like to thank you all. Thank you for letting me read, because I couldn't. Thank you very much indeed. That was really useful. So we'll give time for people to be able to leave.